Chapter 27. Aftermath. "They'll live," Snape said. "Barely." He'd just returned from St. Mungo's, where he'd rushed Harry's 3 attackers after Madame Pomfrey had told him they were beyond her ability to save. As a result, he'd missed the chaos as Aurors had come to lock down the school. All students except Harry had been sent back to their dorms and told to wait. Apparently, an attempt on Harry's life was taken much more seriously after one other Hogwarts student was missing and presumed dead. Harry doubted that there would have been as much of a fuss if he'd been a regular student. They were now in Dumbledore's office. The older man looked grave and serious. Harry was sitting in a chair while Snape paced back and forth. Harry was secretly relieved that the boys hadn't died, but he forced himself to keep his face expressionless. Any sign of weakness just led to more problems later. "If I'd wanted them dead, I'd have just left them there," Harry said, instead of going for help. He'd thought about leaving them there, but killing them anonymously wouldn't have helped him at all. He wanted to send a message to the entire school, and that required that everyone know what had happened. "And yet you set venomous snakes on 3 of your classmates, one of whom was on the Quidditch team." "I'm sure the alternate will do a fine job," Harry said. Despite Snape's anger, Harry wasn't intimidated. After being murdered multiple times, and almost murdered even more, ordinary intimidation tactics didn't bother him much. "From what I hear, Bletchley's not much of a keeper anyway." "This isn't a laughing matter," Snape snapped. "They'll snap your wand for this." "The Aurors said I was in the clear," Harry said mildly. "What?" Snape stared down at him. "I didn't cast any snake summoning spells. I don't even know one," Harry said. "Although I plan to learn it as soon as I can," Dumbledore interjected. "I've already received the Aura's report. Priori incantatem shows that the snakes came from the older boy's wands, not from Harry." "They're all Death Eater's sons," Harry said coolly. "They were trying to kill me." Snape scowled. 3 sixth years corner a second year in a deserted hall," Harry said, "and send 15 venomous snakes after him. What's the likely result?" "The Aura's report noted this as self-defense," Dumbledore said, "and charges will be filed against all 3 boys." Dumbledore looked genuinely regretful. If Harry hadn't known better, he'd have thought the man was a gentle, grandfatherly type. But that kind of man wouldn't have been able to defeat the last 2 Dark Lords or be so involved in politics and the search for Death Eaters that he barely had time to be headmaster. Harry was sure that in 100 years he'd have mastered that look of sincerity as well. "What troubles me is how you were able to turn their own snakes against them," Dumbledore said. "I flatter myself to say that I have made a minor study in spells, and I have never heard of any spell like that." "It wasn't a spell," Harry said. "I just asked nicely." "And they somehow understood you?" Snape asked skeptically. "I've been talking to snakes since I was 10, Harry said. "They're actually more accommodating than you'd think." Snape's indrawn breath was strangely satisfying. "You're saying you're a Parselmouth?" "A what?" Harry asked, although he knew perfectly well what a Parselmouth was. "Can't everyone speak to snakes?" "Everyone can speak to snakes, Harry," Dumbledore said, "but not everyone can make themselves understood or understand the snakes in turn." Snape was silent for a long moment. "There is still the matter of the darkness powder. Similar powder was used in a previous incident, one that endangered other students." "It's a common product," Harry said dismissively. He was getting better at lying, he thought. "Anybody can get hold of it if they know where to look. Are you suggesting that I was the one who petrified Mrs. Norris?" "The heir to Slytherin was suggested to be a Parselmouth," Snape said. "Perhaps you are using that legend to your advantage." "I never claimed to be the heir," Harry said coldly. "The heir was the one who killed my friend. When I find out who that is, I'm going to make them pay." "Making threats, Potter?" Snape asked. Harry looked up at Snape for a long moment, and eventually it was Snape who looked away. "If I'm not going to be punished for defending myself, can I go back to my room?" Harry asked finally. "It's been a long day." Dumbledore nodded tiredly, waving Harry off. Harry glanced at Snape, who was staring at him with an undecipherable expression. He was sure he would pay for all of this later. He'd had a sort of truce with Snape for a long time. The man ignored him, and Harry tried not to do anything too egregious to require the man to pay attention to him. It was likely that Snape still had to deal with Death Eaters, whether he was still a Death Eater or not. Leaving aside the matter of whether Snape actually had any liking or dislike for Harry, he wasn't politically able to show too much favour for him. Harry suspected that showing disfavour wouldn't be as difficult for Snape, considering how he treated other people in class. Dealing with it would be something Harry had to do if it happened. Unlike various murder attempts, worrying about Snape wouldn't actually help. Harry walked out of the room and stopped just at the edge of earshot. "The boy is a sociopath," Snape was saying. "Any other student his age would be in hysterics." Dumbledore said, "Harry's not just any boy his age. He's seen things that no boy his age should have to see." The old man had no idea. Harry imagined that he was talking about the troll and Adrian and being pushed off the stairs. He only suspected Harry of Quirrell's murder. Still, Harry supposed it didn't paint a pretty picture. Murdering one teacher, an entire bucket-load of Cornish pixies, and mortally injuring 3 other students. It did make him sound like a sociopath. However, he also seems to have a tendency to eavesdrop and should be getting back to his quarters, Dumbledore called out. Harry winced and quickly began heading down the stairs. Slipping back to the dungeons, Harry wore his invisibility cloak. Just because 3 people had attacked him didn't mean that there weren't others waiting in the wings. Harry hoped that the incident with the snakes would make those people more reluctant to attack him, but he couldn't be sure how much they'd heard yet. Slipping his cloak off just as he reached the wall that led into the common room, Harry entered. Everyone was in the common room, leaving it much more crowded than usual. As Harry entered, conversation suddenly stopped. Everyone turned and stared at Harry. The only one with the courage to speak to him was Malfoy. "What happened, Potter? No one will tell us anything." "Bletchley, Blishwick and Merton decided to try to kill me," Harry said. He kept a careful eye on the expressions on everyone's faces. They seemed to all be a variation of surprise or puzzlement. It was possible that no one had known about the attack. If the boys had an accomplice, that accomplice was good at keeping control of his or her expressions. "What happened?" Malfoy asked. "I took care of it," Harry said shortly. "They're in St. Mungo's and it looks like they won't be back." Marcus Flint stiffened. Bletchley was one of his team members, and losing him would hurt the team, although Harry had heard that they were considering replacing him anyway. "Looks like you'll be needing another keeper," Harry said. "Sorry." All eyes in the room were on him, and his classmates stared at him in silence. None of them knew just how he'd put 3 older and presumably much stronger classmates in the hospital, and that made them cautious. It was a little like living in a lion cage. The only way to survive was to be the most dangerous thing in the room. "I'm going to bed," Harry said. He was silent for a moment, then said, "If I have any unexpected visitors tonight, they won't be going to St. Mungo's." Harry tapped his wand for emphasis, and he saw some of the younger Slytherins pale. The older students were better at hiding their feelings, but their suddenly expressionless faces were a clue at how they felt. That night he slept dreamlessly, and not a single person bothered him. "Everybody is saying you're planning on being the next Dark Lord," Hermione said. Explaining just how he'd set the snakes on the other students had probably been a mistake, although given that he had been facing attempted murder charges, Harry hadn't seen any other choice. Apparently, some of the students had parents who worked in the ministry, and those parents had read the Auror's reports. "They think I'm the heir?" Harry asked. "Surprisingly, no," Hermione said. "Too many people knew how you felt about Colin, and so people are saying that you and the heir are competing to be the next Dark Lord. They say the heir killed Colin and sent Bletchley and the others to kill you to eliminate the competition." Harry laughed mirthlessly. "Where are my minions?" "What? You can't be a Dark Lord without minions, otherwise you're just a lone crazed terrorist." "People are saying Colin was your minion," Neville offered nervously. He was probably anxious about bringing up Colin, since Harry had been irritable about the whole subject. He'd been going over what he could have done differently to save Colin, and he hadn't been able to think of anything. Watching over the boy 24 hours a day wasn't something he'd been able to do, and there were going to be times when he was alone. "A Dark Lord with one minion is just sad," Harry said. "It's like trying to be a Bond villain while living in a beat-up Volkswagen Beetle." Hermione snickered, while Neville looked confused. Harry forgot sometimes just how separated purebloods were from popular culture. "Wouldn't we be considered your minions?" Neville asked. "The fact that you have to ask means probably yes," Harry said, grinning, "but realistically you aren't subservient enough." When Harry had first met them, Neville had been much more subservient, but Hermione had been working with him on being more assertive. They were all silent for a long moment. Finally, Hermione spoke. "Doesn't it upset you that people think you are a Dark Lord in training?" "If it keeps them from trying to kill me, not really," Harry said. "Besides, do you really think we'd keep having Dark Lords every generation if there wasn't a reason for it?" "What?" "Why do you think people follow Dark Lords? They can't all be evil." Hermione stared at him for a moment, then said, "Some people are too scared not to." Nodding, Harry said, "Also, the Ministry is corrupt. If people were really happy with the government, they wouldn't be following every Dark Lord who promised something better." "People should enter politics if they want to change things," Hermione said indignantly, "not kill people and become terrorists." "What happens if the political cards are stacked against you?" Harry asked. "People try to start revolutions when they think they don't have a voice. I wouldn't be surprised if the next Dark Lord tries to get the Muggleborns to follow him." "Assuming that Dark Lord isn't you," Hermione said. Harry shrugged. "Maybe I've got a future in politics." The disquieted look on Hermione and Neville's faces was almost worth the joke. The next dueling club had a drastic drop-off in numbers, and many of the students refused to duel with Harry. Everyone seemed anxious around him, and even Snape seemed to be following him with his eyes everywhere Harry went. Harry had to make it clear that he would be very disappointed if no one came to the dueling club. It took a couple of weeks, but eventually membership grew again as people realized that Harry wasn't planning to launch snakes at them all. He still felt like he was constantly on display. Everyone watched him wherever he went, and he could sense that the Hufflepuffs especially were uncomfortable with him. Hermione managed to find out what the Chamber of Secrets was from Binns, the ghost who taught history of magic. Given the rumors that he was feuding with the heir of Slytherin, Harry found a few Slytherins who tried to curry favor with him. Some of them had spoken to their families and had learned that the chamber had been opened once before, 50 years before. One student had died in a bathroom, and Hagrid had been accused of awakening the creature. He'd been ejected and had his wand snapped, but he hadn't been sent to Azkaban, which to Harry suggested that there hadn't been any proof. Hagrid wasn't willing to talk about it at all, which Harry found unsurprising. At least the man didn't treat him any differently since the incident with the Slytherins and the snakes. He was loyal, if anything. Harry had managed to convince some of those Slytherins trying to curry favor to get copies of the original reports of the crime, at which he'd learned that Hagrid's accuser had been named Tom Riddle. Furthermore, Moaning Myrtle was the ghost of the girl who had been killed. Asking questions about Tom Riddle had somehow landed Harry back in the headmaster's office, where Harry had directly questioned Dumbledore. Dumbledore had been reluctant to tell Harry, but had eventually revealed who Tom Riddle had become. Obviously, Tom Riddle had discovered the creature 50 years before and was reviving it again. Harry felt vindicated in discovering this. All in all, it took time. It took time for the Slytherins to contact their parents and for their parents to look up reports. It took even more time to send reports back. Christmas break came before Harry knew it, and for once they were all happy to go home to the safety of places that didn't have monsters in the walls. For 2 weeks Harry had nothing to do, and he found his anger and feelings of sadness over Adrian and Colin growing. Voldemort had ruined almost every relationship he'd ever had, erasing friendships in the winds of time or outright killing them. For all the research he'd done, he hadn't found out who Voldemort's agent was in the school, what monster he was using, or where the mythical chamber was hidden. The answer to any two of those questions would give him enough to work on a solution. Returning to Hogwarts, Harry didn't find himself any closer to a solution. They questioned Myrtle, who only knew that the creature had been very large. Harry continued with the dueling club, working harder than ever. His intensity frightened some of the other students, and he insisted on going through more matches than anyone. As far as he was concerned, he needed the matches more than the average wizard. The 5th and 6th years were brutal toward him, but he slowly began to learn how to deal with wandless magic. Flitwick began instructing him. It was difficult, but he knew it was absolutely necessary. On Valentine's Day he received no cards, and no dwarves came to sing to him. That might have been because he was careful to not be in places where he knew the dwarves were. Harry suspected his reputation kept anyone from sending valentines. The rest of the school gradually relaxed, as there were no more attacks, but Harry did not. He assumed that Voldemort was biding his time, waiting to make everyone complacent. It was only a matter of time until the next attack, and Harry wanted to be ready. He studied petrification and concluded that the most likely creature the enemy was using was a basilisk. He'd been able to understand it, and the basilisk was a form of snake, so this was the most likely culprit. The deciding factor was learning that roosters had been slaughtered all throughout the school grounds. Roosters were fatal to basilisks. Harry asked the twins to go to Hogsmeade, but some live chickens. They'd eventually forgiven him for the first darkness powder incident, although he was no longer working as their product tester. They suggested that he go to the headmaster. The headmaster was busy dealing with politics and set a time for a meeting in 2 weeks. He still asked for the chickens, which he asked for Hagrid to care for in secret. Harry named them Alpha and Omega. Still, the school year went on. In March, they had to choose their electives for the next year. Muggle studies would obviously be useless for him, and Harry asked some of the professors and learned that divination was most likely rubbish, unless one actually had the talent. Additionally, it was taught by the woman who had ruined his life by having a vision in a crowded tavern. Harry hadn't realized that. From what he was told, it wasn't something she had voluntary control of, but it was one of the only 2 or 3 true prophecies she'd ever given. He wasn't sure how you could determine a true prophecy from a false one until it came true, but he didn't want to take a class with the woman. His resentment would keep him from taking her class seriously. Care of magical creatures he decided on almost immediately, and arithmancy, because he wasn't sure that studying ancient runes would do much for him. Arithmancy was apparently a requirement to become a cursebreaker, and helped with the creation of new spells. On the day of the next Quidditch match, Harry insisted that they all go. Being alone in the castle was more dangerous than not, bludgers aside. By killing Colin, the enemy had showed that it was targeting Harry specifically, and Hermione and Neville were the only people he was truly invested in. Harry's meeting with the headmaster was scheduled for after the game. He separated from the others and headed for the headmaster's office, which was located in a tower through the gargoyle corridor. As he approached the tower, Harry heard a female voice from behind him. Harry turned to see a familiar red-haired girl. Behind it was something huge and monstrous. He found himself drawn into its eyes. A sudden pain, and he felt that his heart was being ripped from his chest. A moment later, he was dead.